Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion, Voice of the Customer, What Does This Really Mean? I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. There's two different ways to communicate with us throughout the webinar. There's a chat box and there's also a Q&A box. Please use the chat box for all technical issues and the Q&A box for any questions related to the content of the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists for today. We have quite the lineup. Zoe Dowling is our moderator and also our SVP of Research at Focus Vision. She's an eclectic blend of researcher, technologist, sociologist, and marketer, and uses her extensive research expertise to help clients best apply Focus Vision's technological solutions. Next, we have Julianne Rita, VP of Product Management, also from Focus Vision. Julianne is a seasoned product executive with industry expertise in MarTech, omnichannel marketing, and consumer product development. We also have Alan Barkwell, Consumer Research Manager at Farmers Insurance. Alan has over 15 years of experience in consumer research, leveraging the full spectrum of research approaches and techniques to help identify insights and inform business decisions. And last but certainly not least, Stephanie C. Harris, Research Consultant. Stephanie has over 20 years of experience in conducting B2C and B2B market research in financial, merchant services, telecommunications, flooring, and automotive industries. At this time, our panelists are going to turn off their camera and dive right into the discussion. Let's get started.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're coming from. Very excited, and I am so excited and grateful for the panelists that we have joining us to talk about what I think is a really interesting topic. So we're going to be talking about voice of the customer and how did this come around. Well, you know, a few weeks ago, I was writing a blog and it was about voice of the customer. And before I started writing it, I was thinking, okay, yeah, I kind of know what I want to say. And you know, it's pretty obvious. We all know what voice of the customer means. And as I was digging into it, I was thinking, well, hang on. There's some interesting things here. I mean, it kind of feels obvious as to what it is, but you know, it can mean a lot of different things. You can go very narrow and have a very sort of focused idea of what it is, and it can be very broad and just be customer feedback altogether. So that was the genesis of thinking about this topic, and then reaching out and being joined today by, I think, of an eclectic but interesting group, I should say, group of people. So to get things started, I know we've heard a little bit of the bios and so on, but let's hear from each panelist themselves. And I wanted to pose the question around, and Alan, I think let me go to you first. How did you get into market, into customer insights? I think it's always interesting hearing about, we all enter this wonderful industry in different ways, and so I would love to hear how you got into this path.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm not sure where everyone is. So my answer to that question, it's a great question. I think it's a good sort of icebreaker, is I sort of fell into it. I stumbled upon it. I did study marketing in college and had an interest in marketing, but really didn't know what I wanted to do. And an opportunity came up in a small kind of boutique research firm here in Los Angeles, and I jumped at it, and the rest, as they say, is history. So, and by virtue of that, I became almost instantly involved with voice of the customer programs, in particular, more of a CSAT or OSAT kind of approach, and has evolved to, you know, include NPS as a methodology.
Great, thanks, Alan. And yes, I think many of us fell into it, and so I'm curious, Stephanie, is that your case, or was it more of a directed path?
No, I definitely fell into it. I actually went to school and have a BA in psychology, thinking I wanted to be a dentist at one point, and decided that was not going to work after taking physics. So after kind of figuring out what I wanted to do, I got an MBA and got exposed to market research through my MBA program. And after graduate school, as luck would have it, found an opportunity at Chrysler through kind of backward channels, actually, because I actually was in communications there for a little while as well, and took an opportunity to do market research there.
Okay.
Definitely fell into it.
Yeah, I got a theme going on here. And Julianne, I know, so your product is, as we heard, but so you found yourself in this industry, and we'd love to hear a bit about your background and your experience with market research, marketing insights.
Sure. So in building out B2C and B2B products, I work hand in hand with market researchers and user researchers in helping develop an understanding of the voice of our customer programs, and having that influence the development of our products and ensuring that we keep products up to date with the needs of our users and buyers. And so I worked hand in hand in building out product development frameworks that included market research for product discovery, and also user research as we brought things through alpha and beta.
No, great. So you've really got this interesting perspective of working hand in hand with the researchers, and in a variety of different roles as well at different companies.
Correct. Yeah. So working at entertainment companies like Disney, Sony, and Fox, as well as in SaaS platforms that really serve marketers, and with that, the researchers in marketing, to make sure that we understand the need, what they need, why they need it, and that we solve it well in terms of the problems that they have, that they need products to solve.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I thank you, everyone, and I hope everybody listening can get a sense that we have a very nice range of backgrounds coming in here and different perspectives, which is what I was interested in getting when we're talking about voice of the customer. So kind of just diving, let's get to really the heart of the conversation. What does voice of the customer mean to you? And Stephanie, let's go straight to you. What does this wonderful term mean in your view?
It's one of those terms where it has, as you said earlier, a broad implication and very narrow. And I think typically when I hear it, sometimes I kind of cringe because I get worried that people take it down the narrow scope, and versus where I like to think of it, where you are looking at quantitative and qualitative, basically wherever you're going to try to get the customer's input into your products and services. And so it's not limited to just surveys, but it can include user research, ethnography, everything that you could possibly do. And so sometimes when I first hear voice of the customer, I get worried that they just want to take it down that narrow scope of, say, customer satisfaction or NPS scores, so that sort of thing. But for me, it's the broader term of getting that input of the customer into your services, into your products.
So customer feedback really on product services.
Yes.
And that's very tangible in the sense,
well, it helps from a standpoint of what their unmet needs are, trying to uncover what their unmet needs are. It also helps you understand how your products and services that are in market are actually working, and are they doing what they need to do? Are people augmenting them in some sort of way to actually adapt them to what they need? Is it really meeting the needs of your customer? And so if you talk to them, if you got to do more than just a couple of questions in a survey. You've actually got to kind of dig deep and try to get that feedback to really make sure that you're meeting that need for the customer.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense to me. Alan, let's go to you next.
Yeah. So I sort of equate voice of the customer with empathy. So it's really about empathizing with the customer. There's also voice of the employee and other types of listening programs out there that exist, but it's really about empathy. So it's about putting yourself in the shoes of the customer and relating to the experiences that they're having with your brand, with your products, with your services, and being able to understand where their pain points are, and also using it in a positive way to celebrate wins and celebrate great experiences, and using those as coaching opportunities with your associates, with your team, to build upon that and create great experiences for the customer. So it's really about empathy.
So and I like that way of putting it. It's really about empathy and seeing how it's relating to you and your brand. And it's interesting, you said it's brand as well. So Stephanie, and I was going to maybe ask there how you're feeling about this. I think you talked about sort of how they're relating to your product and services. Are we opening that up to include brand? Because of course, customer experience, is that going too far? I mean, Alan, from what you're saying, it feels like customer experience is part of it. It's a kind of a holistic, how they're interacting with you, full stop. you know, in any of those interactions, or is that just another one of the definitions that it's more around products and services? Stephanie, let's come back to you.
Oh, that was me. Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
I think it's a little bit of all of that, and I think that's where, I mean, so it's one of those things, to your point, where it does sort of it encompasses a lot of things. I think, you know, there's sort of this, I think there are times that it kind of goes down a path of being more customer experience oriented, versus, I like the way that Alan mentioned it in terms of being empathetic to your customer. And so that then incorporates not only your experience with the products and services, but how they're interacting with your company, with your brand in total. And so I think in my mind, I mean all of that as well. So it's sort of the total picture, just not kind of narrowing just that scope down to one thing or the other.
This is Julianne. I think I echo both of you. Usually, like when I come into an organization and they say, what's your voice of the customer program? I kind of have a mental list of, okay, we have CSATs, we have customer advisory boards, we have beta and alpha programs. When we build the products, we have user research and qual. But if at the end of the day, you don't get those nuggets that build empathy with the people that are building your products, then I think you've lost, you know. So a lot of times, I would say a lot of the qual stuff and the little nuggets that come from qualitative research give you that nugget, that like to spark for the product and design individuals in your organization that are solving those problems. They need that holistic, empathetic look to understand deeply the pain points of our customers, because without that, they're just data points.
Yeah, so Julianne, what I'm hearing from you is sort of it being, like everybody else is saying, it's a broader, it shouldn't necessarily be thought as so narrow, though I think we're all saying, and please jump in if I'm not recapping this as you feel, but it does feel that when we hear the term, it can be quite a narrow application of it, but everybody here is feeling that it really is, it's like that whole, it's all encompassing around how the customers feeling and creating those connections and the empathies. And Julianne, I liked how you were talking about, you feel holistically, it was also bringing in sort of a qualitative approach and getting the nuggets. So I kind of wanted to go back to Alan. I think I wanted to go back to you and say, you know, what is, when we actually talk about seeing it working well, I mean, I know you're primarily a quantitative researcher, let me put that, or maybe you're a full quantitative researcher, because we were talking about this yesterday. And, you know, is that, you know, how do you see sort of the best implementations of voice of the customer, and what does that really encompass?
Yeah, so I am a self-described quanti. Spend most of my time in data and dealing with the numbers, if you will, and lots of scorecards. But so the question about where I've seen it work well, I think it's when you have the ability, and so again, this is from a quant kind of lens, is when you have the ability to surface insights around different journeys, customer journeys at your fingertips, and being able to drill down into the journey to identify where you know, we use the word friction or pain points, you know, sort of interchangeably, but where those friction points exist so that we can reduce the friction for our customers. And where it really works well is when you see the information, the data being put into action, and you know, that success being shared in the organization, and you know, saying, hey, look, we listened and we did it. We solved for this problem because the customer, you know, told us either through solicited or unsolicited feedback that this was a problem, and it was getting in their way of doing something or completing a task. In some cases, it's as simple as they want to pay you, and you want to make that as easy as possible. So you have to listen for those signals in the data so that you can take action on it.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. Julianne, do you have any sort of, have you seen anything that really, you know, works incredibly well? And in fact, I'm also interested in, you know, the other side of what's not worked.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times in organizations, they have CSAT general surveys, but a lot of times you'll get something when you're sitting in the product shoes of they're not happy with the usability of the product, which as somebody who's trying to solve product problems is not deep enough for you to be able to get into, well, tell me more, right? And so a lot of times you get handed a voice of the customer program, but you have to build out another qualitative layer that dices out the problems to solve. And then once you have, these are the problems to solve, then it's going to be sitting down with the user researchers, sitting down with the market researchers and saying, okay, how do we bring insights so that we know we're solving the problems that are going to move the needle to help us increase overall usability of the product or an NPS score. So I think it is definitely like NPS and CSAT in particular are like peeling an onion. It's not enough to know usability, stability. You have to know more. And that's when partnering with research is so key, is that often you're peeling that onion together in deciding this is a worthwhile problem to solve, and this is not is not advantageous to our business. So having that partnership between research and product is key, because they own the methodologies of how can we solve these problems well, and you own the how do we keep this product viable and focus on the right things. That is such an important partnership.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I'd be very curious, both Alan and Stephanie, in your experiences, you know, how much, and I'm sure it differs from organization to organization. So we're hearing Julianne talking about the partnership with the research organizations from a product perspective. And of course, there's going to be brand, and there could be operations. I mean, you know, the employee. Do you see this in your experience? Have you seen voice of the customer programs, and using that in a very broadest way possible? You know, sort of partnering with other groups and giving them that feedback, and you know, constructing questions and maybe it's surveys, but maybe it's also getting qualitative data in the ways that are giving them the answers they need. So I guess I'm primarily asking about how far have you seen the VOC programs sort of get disseminated within different groups within the organization to help, Alan, as you talked about, you know, it's about reducing friction, it's about creating to those and putting points into action. Just love to hear a bit more about how that works.
Yeah, so at least in my organization, it's used primarily, not only exclusively, but mostly for like operational reasons. So we have a massive call center and online chat for our customers, and you know, we're always looking for ways to improve those experiences, not exclusively, like I said, but primarily that it can be used from an operational standpoint. So to kind of answer your question, you're right, different organizations have adopted it to different degrees. Some are just sort of scratching the surface with it and seeing what's possible, and others have, you know, sort of really figured out how to kind of take it and run and apply it in different ways. I do like the conversation so far about integrating it into product or service design or experience design, because that's kind of I'm probably getting ahead on some of the questions, but like, you know, it's kind of an emerging area, at least for us, in terms of thinking about how to integrate that into what we do.
So it's great. And before I go to you, Stephanie, I think it's great to actually bring up this next. I just had this kind of stat that from a recent Harvard Business Review analytical services study, I'm saying, you know, 64% of business executives say that the voice of the customer programs are very important to their customer experience management. Okay, so 2/3, very important. Yet only a quarter are saying their VOC program is very effective. So there is a disconnect going on there, and I'm wondering what each of you kind of think could be going on there. Is it that these programs are just, you know, they haven't necessarily, to say, we've just said different organizations have different levels of integration and how they're approaching this, and this is of course challenging. I mean, like, I'm not trying to suggest it's not challenging, but curious on your thoughts. And I think let me throw this over to you, Stephanie, just for this, and also what we've been talking about, how we're seeing different programs implemented, and just perhaps hear also some of the challenges around getting that customer feedback.
I think in my experience has been the level of integration has always been the issue. You know, a lot of the organizations that I've been working with, while we might have some of these CSAT scores and things integrated into a lot of what we're doing, it's not necessarily a voice of the customer program or customer experience oriented. So we start to see things, say in a brand tracking study, for example, and it's sort of hand raisers. We see something happening, let us then try to fix it. So then when you think about the less effective programs working, you know, depending upon how structured your program is not, you know, you're going to have it sort of as a, it's not going to really do as well. Some of the organizations I've worked in, we have kept it more from a research standpoint than having, as Julie sort of suggested, having a program that then works with the other groups. So ours has always been rather integrated, and looking at it from more of an experience standpoint. How can we improve their experience? Looking at it from more of a journey standpoint. So I think that is where you start to see a lot of what is happening. And I think a lot more companies are starting to really focus on what can we do to get this program a lot more structured so that we can get more value out of it.
I was with a large health insurance company too, and I think one of the things that I saw working cross-functionally with research and customer care and online chat was that, you know, like the touch points of the customer go everywhere, and a lot of times the people on the front end of the call centers are leveraging, you know, decades old processes that are just not very customer centric. Mm-hmm. And so I saw a lot of effectiveness of having like a CX organization come in, build empathy, and blow up the existing processes, both in how they managed customer care and the voice that they use to represent their brand. So I think a lot of times it's hard when you're told this is the process to be on the front line and know that this process isn't customer centric, but you're not empowered to change that. Mm-hmm. And that it takes a lot to blow that up.
Yeah.
You know?
You almost have to start in one little area and kind of work it through.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of find yourself a low-hanging fruit win without a lot of visibility, and then bump that needle up a little bit, right, and then kind of move on to the next big problem to solve. That's what I've seen effective. But I think if you just say, here's what the data said, go fix it, without somebody skilled in getting the data from a quant and qual perspective to change things dramatically, especially in the insurance industry, I think the
effectiveness of the programs too connects all the dots for the various different organizations within your company. So, you know, if your product development team is focused only on what they see as important, and then your customer care is doing something totally different, you definitely have a disconnect in how that then works within your organization and where that really plays into, to your point, it makes it harder to kind of focus on the customer cohesively, you know, and making sure that experience is making sense for them. And in a lot of cases, and I want to make it sound like the companies I've been working for have been dysfunctional, but in a lot of cases, I think that's how, you know, the development team has their goal and their focus, and they're focused on the customer, but it's maybe a different perspective than the customer care team. And they all have what they consider voice of the customer within their group, in terms of how they're approaching their experiences.
And I think a lot of times the researcher is the ones that are going, listen, you are all part of this journey, not just this touch point that you live in.
Exactly.
And it's hard to empower the researchers to say, holistic, hello. That's hard. That's why I think there's all these digital transformation initiatives going on, is to restructure organizations to be customer centric so that we're not all in our silos.
Yes, definitely. And I think you're starting to see that happening a lot more, making it a lot easier.
Alan, does this resonate with you in sort of creating more of a customer centric process that's bringing in all aspects of the organization?
Oh yeah, for sure. There's definitely a level of, I guess, like, you know, customer centricity maturity, out there, and different organizations are at different stages of that maturity. I'm just like, I keep staring at this beautiful stat, and I'm really like, I'm zeroing in on where it says very effective. And I'm thinking from a business executive perspective, like they're very metric focused. They're very, ROI focused, or like what is this investment giving me, and what is it giving the organization, and how does it translate? And I think we're still in a very, early stage in general with VOC programs or customer experience programs of measuring that and being able to show the return on the investment, and ultimately the impact on either the top line or the bottom line, whichever the organization is primarily focused on. So a business executive would probably say, well, show me the numbers, give me the numbers, and I think we're getting there, and so some have a quarter have made some progress, and others are still working on it.
I think that those are great points from all of you. I think what it brought to my mind was that we know this, we're in such a period of rapid change and flux. And if you think of the last 20 years, so the first 2 decades of this century, of how much has changed, and what was it, the experience economy being something term coined in, was it the 90s, and moving into this century, how customer centricity and customer experience is just paramount. And on top of this, we have, or at the same time and going hand in hand, all the technological changes, all the cultural changes, the organizational changes, and how everything's working. And we're kind of at this crux where all of these things need to come together, but there's so many things going on within businesses and organizations that this is just another great challenge as we're seeing of how do we create those customer-centric processes. And as you just said, Alan, it's like how what is the ROI on that? And how are they all structured so that we are getting them to be sort of cross-organization, inter and intra-department, and everybody working the same page. And hey, any organization that's figured all of that out is obviously going to be doing incredibly well. But it is a challenge, a live challenge that we're dealing with. And I think this whole idea of understanding your customer and hearing their voice and going back to those feedback loops and making sure that action's taken and making sure that everybody within the organization's hearing and being able to act upon it is, it's not an easy challenge to address and to overcome. I think I'd like to move on to the next, and let's get very, tangible and tactable with, what should we be looking at as a staple of customer feedback? So, and again, you can see I use the customer feedback term instead of like the VOC, because that's showing my bias coming in there, because I feel as if customer feedback is a better catch-all than VOC. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Because I think I'm seeing now, I'm putting my lens on just with the questioning there, but customer feedback versus VOC, anybody got quick fire thoughts on how should we be calling it? Would you get rid of the term VOC? Keep it? Is it good?
I think it's here to stay.
No choice.
Yeah. So to answer the question, I would say, any sort of open-ended. So if you're doing surveys, any sort of open-ended question. I don't mean just any open-ended question, but open-ended questions help to provide context, and it actually gives the opportunity for the customer to have their voice heard. So it's not just some random comment, but it's really, I think you have to think through the question that you ask, because you're going to only get 1 or 2 opportunities in any given survey to ask an open-ended question, just to make it a simpler, straightforward experience for the customer. Also, they have limited time, etc. So how you ask the open-ended questions is really crucial, so that it can be turned into action. So just we're going to get to this eventually, but NPS has a methodology, sort of prescribed methodology, which you can follow to a T, and they've actually evolved it over time. So it really has to do with the question that you follow up your likelihood to recommend with, and how you ask that, whether it's, why did you give us that rating, which was sort of the original methodology, or is it, what could we have done better, or how could we improve the experience? You can start to, really make it more actionable by thinking through how you ask that question.
So that's good. Let's go into NPS. But it was
here we
only
go.
so long. Yes, here we go. So it was only so long before we get there, because I think that it is pretty much a staple of customer feedback of VOC today. So as you've just talked about, Alan, there is that prescribed kind of question on how do you, and I'm blanking on the exact wording right now. It's would you recommend us to a friend or family? Is that?
Yeah, how likely are you to recommend us to, I think originally it was a friend, family member, or colleague. You can just simply ask, how likely are you to recommend us? But yeah, that's the original way it was worded.
And it was as an approach methodology. It was in the early 2000s. Am I correct on how this came about? And Alan, I know you've got a lot of thoughts and on how it started out and why it was good at the time and how it shifted. I'd love to just hear a bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Bain has been recognized as kind of the founders of this metric. So very well-known consultancy working with different clients identified a need for essentially a feedback mechanism to power change in the organization around customer experience. I'm going to butcher some of the details, but that's pretty broad. And they came up with this methodology of asking, how likely you are to recommend, and you've got your promoters, your passives, and detractors. Your detractors in particular are 10 times more likely to say something negative about your company, while a promoter is more likely to say something positive. So it really gets at word of mouth and the importance of word of mouth in sort of marketing perspective. So yeah, that's kind of the Cliff Note version of the history of NPS. But by virtue of just being a pretty well respected and known consultancy, it sort of spread like wildfire. And it wasn't very long, after, I think it was about 2003 when it originally came about. And I would say by the end of the decade, it started to become a very common metric in organizations. And it hasn't really stopped, and it continues to evolve over time with the times as well.
And I think that that's really interesting in the sense that in a relatively short period of time, there is something, because it is so concise,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a lot of, in that sense, value. It's measurable, it's trackable over time, all of these things that are great in terms of KPI and monitoring and measuring performance. And as you said, covering that word of mouth and covering that, how am I doing? And ideally we're all of our customers are promoters, and we, really limiting the detractors. So there's a lot of really nice things in there. And I think it is quite intuitive to a degree as to why it's been latched upon. But it doesn't, there's challenges to it. Anybody else got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is Julianne. There's challenges with it because in particular, it doesn't really look at what are the right, you just get this NPS score and the what to solve underneath it and the what should you solve underneath it is really, is not really there in the methodology. So you have to, as a person kind of living with NPS as a reality, start peeling the onion on, okay, what do the open-ends say about the product or the customer care? And so you go down rabbit holes without the lens of what is a viable problem to solve, because there are organizations that are no longer exists. This is going to date me, but in the .com era, there was Cosmo, and it was awesome because free delivery of whatever I wanted. There's now Amazon now, but no service fee, no shipping, no tips. It's just like you could call up at 10 o'clock at night and say, hey, Cosmo, can you deliver me People magazine and a pint of Ben & Jerry's? Somebody would ring your doorbell 15 minutes later. Awesome NPS, not viable, right? So a lot of times what you're faced with in product or as a, you know, as a business executive is just because it's a pain point doesn't mean it's viable to solve for our business. And so that's when you have to really have the lens of being in front of NPS to say what problems are most important for our business to solve that are detractors. And what's really who are the detractors, and are they worth solving for too? So there's a lot underneath it of just because you could doesn't mean you should. From a business viability standpoint, I was thinking also, I was mentioning Washington Mutual went under and eToys went under, and they would have had fabulous NPS scores. But you have to think about a viable business.
So, yeah, and I think that's a great, that's a great point. I was just going to add that one of the benefits of NPS, you know, here in 2020 is that it is a pretty ubiquitous question. It gets asked a lot. Which allows for benchmarking too. So you kind of getting at viability in a way you can have an understanding for where you stand relative to others, either in your industry or, you know, against, you know, stalwarts like, you know, you mentioned Amazon. So there are some benefits to it, and it's one thing to just, you know, kind of only, you know, look at your own scores if you gather feedback yourself. It's another to see kind of where you stand relative to that, because you might be making improvements to processes and products and services, but your competitors are as well. So you need to have some way to know where you stand and track that over time.
Right.
Yep.
But the other challenge too, I mean, this is when you're talking about NPS, I think sometimes you're talking about the aspect of how it's actually what you're describing. And then there's also the side that, you know, where they're using it sort of to help their sales team get their bonuses, if you will. So would you recommend this? And then, so there's the flip side of that where it's not, I don't think, getting used as well too. So, and I think that's where you really want to kind of take it back to how do we really use this to help us improve our customer experience, and so, look at what is really causing the scores to be where they are, not just sort of pushing it out there in front of people.
So is it somewhat like, you know, people go online and they rate you well on Amazon, and then suddenly you're saying, look, we're awesome, but actually it's because you have plugged in tapping into the promoters in order to make the numbers look good.
Right, exactly. Or you know, I think I used this before, where in another discussion where you have the sales team at your dealership hand you a survey and say, please rate us a 10.
Yes.
On our scores. We hope we did well for you. And then, you know, so then you have that kind of feedback coming back, and it's like, yeah, we're doing really great. But to your point, are you really looking at what's going on behind the scenes, and is there something we really need to be focused on? So I think when you're using the NPS score, it definitely requires additional information and you know, to work with it to make sure that you're steering the company back to what's going to be viable for the company. On that
and to address that, in my organization, we actually don't share scores. We share contextual feedback, or the verbatim, with our frontline as an opportunity to, you know, coach them on ways to improve the experience and not really focus on the score. People want it. People like metrics. Businesses like metrics. We get it. Some industries have, you know, kind of fallen a bit on this one. I think, you know, the car dealership example is one that is very, very common. I think almost all of us probably experienced that to some extent if we own and service a car. But there are ways around that, and it's when you and this is something that Bain discusses, you know, a lot, because it's criticism of the program that comes up very often. And they said, we never said to manage to the score. It was never about managing the score. It was about listening to what the customers were saying. You need to do better.
Agreed. I think that's where some of the lack of effectiveness in the slide that you showed before might be coming out. Some of that disconnect as well.
Yeah, I think all of this makes so much sense. There's a lot of value from NPS, and it is an interesting a question to ask and metric to track. At the same time, it's how it's implemented. And this goes for anything, of course, but it's how it's implemented. What are you using it for? And Stephanie, you brought up the bonuses, and also the I think a real problem with when you are gimme 10s. So you've got two things that fall apart there when it's not implemented when it's implemented in a way rather where it's people are saying, hey, I'm going to get a bonus based off of your rating and it's got to be a 10. And also just that's how we are measuring people's performance. But when it's actually used to, okay, so what's going on? How can we listen and understand to our customers? And Alan, I think you said this right at the out, and that you started with this. It's the open-ended question that follows it, and how you craft that open-ended question so that you then are getting their feedback, that you're truly hearing their voice as to why they're saying that, what is going on, and therefore being able to take that feedback and improve or say, hey, we're doing this really well. Because it's not always just about improving it. Sometimes, hey, this was really great. Okay, great. We're going to take notice of that and make sure that that's something we continue doing. So it seems to be all about it's the implementation, it's how it's used, and getting some of that follow up, the additional data to explain the why.
Yes.
Yeah, there was one question that I think Monica brought up, that is it possible to overuse NPS for overall company and each individual product? From a product perspective, I would say absolutely yes, because oftentimes, especially you have it at every touch point, and again, it doesn't get you to what's wrong with the product if you're a product manager. It gets you, what you need to know is what's underneath that and what's worth solving, because in many cases you have to solve for both satisfaction of the buyer and satisfaction of the end users. So from what's a staple of customers' feedback, from if you're sitting as a product manager, there's 3 things that you have to look at any given point. And this is why I implement like a learning roadmap with research, is that you need to look to the future, which is with the analyst community often, of where is market research heading. You have to look to the existing, which I tend to like CSAT better, because it gives you a pulse on, are they satisfied with our product and where do they not see the satisfaction? Would they recommend us is absolutely true. And then the tactical of what are you building right now, and is it satisfactory and is it usable to the end users of your product? So in many cases, from a product standpoint, getting an NPS is 1,000 good product decisions that are sitting with user research and with product managers in getting the pulse of solving the problem right. So you have to have those 3 layers in your VOC program. So you're looking to the future, you're looking to your existing client base, and you're looking to what are you building right now to improve the overall experience. That's the product point.
Yeah, sure. And I think, because that's quite interesting, just looking at the question that's on screen around what's the staple of customer feedback, and from the product perspective, there's all of those different layers that need to come into it. And NPS, just as we were talking about, has its role, but there are also other elements. Alan, Stephanie, before we move on, is there anything you would like to add in this kind of area? Is there a staple for you on customer feedback, or is it, I mean, we could always just say it depends, because it depends what your objectives are and what you're looking to do.
Mm-hmm. No, I think we've covered it. I would agree that it does depend. But I think we've covered it in.
Yeah. Okay, so let's we've got a couple more questions before, and then I'm loving to see that there's some Q&As coming in from people listening in. So we've vaguely covered this as well, the role of non-survey approaches in customer feedback. And if I'm just going to summarize what we've heard, and would love to hear any builds that you've had, I think that there's, within the survey, I mean, the survey is definitely the predominant mechanism for getting VOC approaches. And Alan, you were quick to bring up, we have our closed-ended questions, but also make good use and smart use of those open-ended questions, which are, they're qualitative in their own right. But is there roles for using, say, online interviewing or online communities or any other types of or even ethnographic approaches within VOC programs?
I would say definitely. There's a variety of different I guess you can call them voice of the customer platforms out there. I know we're not really here to talk about specific ones. I'm not going to mention names, but there are platforms out there that allow you to bring in non-survey feedback or even conversations. So you can bring in chats or phone call transcripts, CRM data or CRM information from those systems to give you an even broader view. And so that really pushes the platforms to be able to process that. And a lot of it has to do with text analytics and the massive processing of using natural language processing to basically parse through all of these comments and what people are saying, so that you can ideally, and I'm a quantify what people are saying, so that you can then use that to prioritize and say, this is what our customers are saying most, or this is what our customers are saying the most, and they have low sentiment or NPS or whatever the KPI is, so that you can prioritize improving those experiences, because they'll have the most meaningful impact on your top line numbers.
That makes a lot of sense. Stephanie, any builds from you?
No, I think he's pretty much covered. I think one could then think about maybe expanding beyond, and this is where sort of Julie's process has been, working with your research team to help build upon some of that, and work with your voice of the customer team to then see what you need to bring in. Maybe it is more ethnography, maybe it is some ideas to kind of really build upon what you're hearing to understand that viability.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I do. I think the VOC platforms are really interesting because they tap into the ways that customers are talking to you, or maybe you're not listening. So I've done a lot of work with researchers in splitting out data from apps. If you have an app for your health insurance portal, or for transit apps, for example, and you look at the basically open ends of you suck in many cases, you have to sit with the researchers and kind of say, we've got to parse this data and figure out, is it usability? Is it stability of the platform? Is it customer care? In many cases, when you talk about mobility apps, is it the driver routes? Is it the way we train our drivers? Or in health insurance, like, okay, they rated our app not well. Is it our provider directory? Is it the way we show our claims data? So even with that, you might not think this is a survey, but they're giving you feedback. And in many cases, it's up to the organization to listen to that voice of the customer that isn't like a methodology, but they're telling you something, and be able to parse out what's really meaningful for you to improve that experience. Because many cases, they're going to be the people that are going to write in about the App Store are giving you problems to solve. And you have to decide for yourself, is it a viable problem to solve? Is it the right problem to solve now? And then, man, there's hundreds, thousands of ratings on the App Store. Let's figure out what we solve, because it's kind of all over the map in terms of what's wrong.
So I think that's really great and interesting, because what I take from that is there's lots of different ways that we can hear the voice of the customer, and we can listen to them. And Julian, you've just brought up the one there about, if you have an app and you're looking at those feedback, the reviews on the App Store, and that's one way of listening. And Alan, you had brought in the kind of the text analysis from say telephone transcripts and so on. And what it made me think is, and we know this, there's so much data out there, and they can be data that is directly the voice of the customer, because they're interacting with you in one way or the other through providing a review, or by engaging with you by speaking to your customer service representatives and so on. There's also I would say more behavioral data that might help show what they're doing, that could be layered in there. And I think I think it feels to me that, a great way of going, and of course this is challenging, but basically bringing in all the data that you can, big and small, to flesh out what is going on and what people are doing and what's going on, and then helping ask questions around to get what their true voice is. So that's kind of what I took from this piece, that we can focus in on the survey, and we often do, and oftentimes, as we've just talked about, it's around the NPS, the CSAT questions that also come in, but there's also a lot of other data that we can and should be using when we're having these types of programs. Given time, let me move on to the final catch-all question that I had, and let's do a quick fire around the room on if you were to cast a magic wand, and you were the Sarah of it all, what's the one thing you would change or implement in all customer feedback programs? So let's go to you, Alan.
Oh, this question, I love this question, but I'm struggling on even a good answer here. Other than, I would say, and I mentioned this previously, just the one thing I would sort of change is the focus on the metric, the focus on the score. I know it's hard to think about it that way, but really focusing on what people are saying, or what the customer says, however you collect that information, whether it be surveys and calls, chat transcripts, etc. You're just listening to what people are saying and paying attention to that, versus just paying attention to the score. The score usually will come or follow when you make improvements. It'll be there, but really listening and empathizing with the customer.
That's great. Julianne?
So I think one thing that I would change is that the VOC program has to come with digital transformation. So if you get tasked I need to set up a voice of the customer program, my advice would be, okay, if we are going to listen to the voice of the customer and change our products or change our organization or change our call center, we are going to have to change our processes. We are going to have to likely change the way we incentivize people to answer customers. So before you journey out, you absolutely have to have authority to make a digital transformation. It's not going to happen. You're not going to see value out of your VSC program unless you're allowed to look cross-functionally and change things. So if there's one thing I always say is no voice of the customer program should be kicked off without empowerment to change the org if you want to move that needle.
That's great. And Stephanie?
I guess it's a little bit of all those. Basically, when you're having with the program, make sure that you have processes in place to really, respond to what the customer is telling you, and making those improvements, and really trying to make sure that you're listening well to them, so that you can, move that needle if you want the metric to move. But really, the real key there is to try to make sure that you're listening to the customer and making sure that you're responding to what you're hearing from them.
Yeah, I think that's great. Because if I summarize all three of those, it's first, if we're asking customers for their opinion, so we want their voice, to make sure that we listen, and we do so with empathy, and we're trying to understand where they're coming from. Make sure that we've got feedback loops in place, so that when we are seeing things aren't working so well, how do we address that? How do we make sure that voice isn't going unheard and unaddressed? And then finally, as you said there, Julianne, around digital transformation, I mean, things are changing, and how we've always done things isn't going to always work, and likely there has to be some changes in processes on how we do things, make sure that it's cross-functional, and so we need to be looking at that within our organizations when we're implementing it. So I think that's a very nice summary of where we got to. I think this final question got us all the way there, but thank you very much. I see we've only got a couple minutes left, and thank you for all the questions that have come in. I think that here's one I did just want to start with. We'll take two, but each of you, somebody's asked, what's the best piece of advice for an organization at the very start of its VOC journey? Is there anything and if I was to think about the question, it's like, where do you start? I mean, because you can't start with everything in one go. It is piece by piece, and so is perhaps starting with putting that NPS and or customer satisfaction questions in place. What advice would you give? Alan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I actually thought Julianne's answer to the last question was how I would think about, where you begin, which is you have to begin with an acceptance and understanding of, we're going to get feedback. It's going to tell us that we need to do things differently, and we're prepared to make those changes. And it's cultural. So if the culture doesn't exist to, support that, it's going to be very difficult. So I would say it's got to be about a customer-centric or customer-focused culture. If that already exists, then you're in a good position to begin, and then you can start measuring and gathering feedback. That would be my advice.
That makes sense. Stephanie or Julianne, anything to build there?
I would say if you're partnering with like a business stakeholder, what is the business outcome that you want out of this VOC program? Or at least what is your hypothesis that you think a VOC program would solve? That way you're aligned with the business on the outcome, and you've got a North Star with your VOC program of what this executive is trying to solve. Because, like NPS, just because you have a VOC program doesn't mean that it's effective. But if you align on the hypothesis that you're trying to solve, you'll get that executive support when you do have to go in and make changes to processes and cross-functional collaboration.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So the final question I will just bring up, it's one that came right at the beginning as we were talking about, VOC and brand product services and so on. And the question says, perhaps a construct is to think of VOC from brand, product service, and experiences point of view. And what do we think about this? And I think where we got to in the discussion is that, I think looking at it from those different lenses makes a lot of sense, because we are thinking about the customer holistically. We're thinking about, the experience touches brand, it touches products and services. And so I think we do need to think about it in all of those views. Quite specific. I don't know if anybody else has got anything to add there, just around thinking about it more holistically.
Yeah, if you can bring those three parts together and say, here's the many problems to solve that would help us with the VOC. So we've got to change perception. I've got to fix the product, and call centers got to work. And then kind of say, how we move that up together? That's a good way to collaborate. Would be my kind of, if you're in the seat of the researcher, it's you bringing them together to see all the journey points, and you as owning kind of the VOC program can tell this is a product problem, this is an experience problem, but we all make up really this experience as voice of the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna call it a day there. We're literally on the hour. Thank you very much to everybody listening in. Really appreciate you being here. And I thoroughly appreciate and I've enjoyed the conversation with all of you. Alan, Stephanie, Julianne, thank you so much for joining. I thought this was great. And I think everybody else will hopefully agree with that as well. So thank you, everybody. And Rachel, that's us due to close up.
Great. Thanks, Zoe. And thanks so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. It was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, it looks like we've reached the end of our time together. If there were any questions that didn't get answered, we will definitely follow up soon. Or you can email us at webinars@focusvision.com and we will respond to your question at that time. We hope you enjoyed today's panel discussion, Voice of the Customer, What Does This Really Mean? We hope to see you at future webinars. Have a great day, everyone.